Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I'll briefly talk about epistemic violence. Now, this is a term that we occasionally read in postcolonial studies books. Spivak famously points to it in Can the Subaltern Speak and in most of our other works. And a viewer from the channel had requested me to explain it. So now I'm not going to go into the details of where the term comes from or who wrote about it or what are its philosophical genealogies, but mostly what it means. So the concept of the episteme, like a body of scientific knowledge that exists at any given time, of course, is connected to it. So there are two signifiers here: epistemic violence. Now, when Spivak refers to Foucault, I can't recall the sentence, but the sentence is that Foucault talks about the epistemic violence within the context of sanity. But in the colonial situation, there is a two-handed engine at work, two-headed engine. Now, that reference to the two-headed engine, of course, is from Milton, and no one really knows what it is. If you know, please do let me know. But what Spivak is talking about within the context of colonialism is that there is physical violence, of course, that is the occupation of colonial lands, right? And we mostly talk about that. But what also happens is that the existing knowledges, existing ways of looking at the world are also overwritten by the episteme, by the discursive frameworks that the colonizers introduce. And in so many cases, even when the physical violence has ended, the after effects of the epistemic violence continue. Because if you've lost your history, if you've lost your languages, and you've incorporated in your consciousness the European or the colonial ways of looking at the world, then that act of epistemic violence has sort of wiped you off your own history that you could have retrieved and mobilized. No one is saying that it's possible to retrieve that. Now, out of all the other post-colonial scholars, Chinwe is the one who tackles this aspect of epistemic violence. He doesn't use the term, but in his book, Decolonizing the African Mind, when he's talking about the Arab influence and then the European influence on Africa and African nations, and when he says we need to retrieve our African histories, our African stories, so that we can articulate in modernity an African way of dealing with things. That is his response to long-term epistemic violence. And that is what I understand from it. Now, most of the time, the replacement of the existing modes of thinking, existing modes of feeling, or existing modes of governing yourself, no one forces it on you. The way it was done in the colonies was through the educational system. And there's a lot of writing on it. I have a couple of videos on it too. One of them is called Language and Power. Please do watch it. But when the British introduced their educational system in Africa, in Nigeria, here in India or Pakistan, it doesn't just force people or encourage people to learn English and English modes of thinking. It also overwrites their own modes of thinking. And in so many ways, in the colonial school systems, if you relied on native languages or used native languages, you were derided and made fun of. And so look at that legacy. Even now in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, if you speak English, sometimes people would make fun of your accent because they somehow believe that if you're going to speak in English, it should be the British accent. These are all micro and macro aspects of epistemic violence. Now, in interpersonal relationships, epistemic violence can also be when you silence someone, when you don't let them speak, or don't give their voice the credence that they deserve, right? It's kind of a semiotic violence, but it is an epistemic violence because you're silencing an individual or a group or a constituency politically through force or by simply isolating them or not paying attention to them. It can be in gender terms, it can be in ethnicity and racial terms, all of those where physical violence is not used, but the law, a body of knowledge, certain discourses, right, certain understanding of the world, when it is imposed on a group of people or individuals, that's an act of epistemic violence. Now, where it comes really clearly across is in the works of Abul Ala Maududi, in one of his 1937 essays, which was later collected in a collection of essays called Tanqihat, where he talks about the loss of culture to the British. And he distinguishes between the loss of political power, but then the loss of intellectual power too. How is it that the British take over the intellectual realm of India as well? And that is what he considers a bigger loss. And obviously he's talking about epistemic violence, how it reshapes the way people think their reality or their identity or their loyalties. So overall, these are some of my ideas on epistemic violence as an outcome of colonialism. Maybe not a direct outcome, because physical violence was part of it. But when you establish a colonial system, you establish a body of law, you establish a school system, you want to develop certain ways of thinking the world because you need people who will work with you. All of these acts that don't use force but use ideological means are acts of epistemic violence. The question, of course, remains is whether or not the histories that colonized people lost are retrievable or not, and whether it is something we ought to do. I mean, I'm personally opposed to any pure retrievals, right? But I'm with Chinwe that there is a need to at least retrieve those silenced knowledges, what Foucault calls buried knowledges, right? And juxtapose them with the dominant knowledge to undo somewhat the epistemic violence. Now, if you go to decolonial studies, to people like Walter Minvolo and others, then they are trying to articulate not just retrieval of lost knowledges, but forcing that way of thinking the world, juxtaposing it against the drive of Western reason, and see if we can come up with a different way of experiencing and thinking the world and living in it, right? Against the logic of reason as we understand it within the Western context. So these are some of my thoughts about epistemic violence. You can read further on it. If I find some sources, I'll post them in the description. And if you have any questions, please feel free to send them my way. Thank you so much. I hope you're taking care of each other. Please continue to do so, and I will now see you next time. Until then, as always, peace and love.